21st. It is 7 p.m., and this meeting is officially in order. Art Becky will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Art. Okay, the next thing on the agenda is a consent agenda. I would have a motion from somebody to approve.
I would make a motion we approve the consent agenda.
Wayne?
I'd like to withdraw item G.
Okay, item G, Wayne would like to withdraw. Any other items anybody would like to withdraw?
Do we want to?
Let's approve the rest of the agenda. John made a motion for it without item G, and then we'll go on from there, Dan, to discuss it. Oh.
A motion you could make?
Yeah.
He's making a motion to...
There's already a motion on the floor.
John made the motion.
Right, John did.
Your Honor, I think you have an amendment to the agenda.
I do.
If we could have that previous motion withdrawn, deal with the amended agenda change, and then move to the consent agenda.
John, would you withdraw your motion at the moment?
Withdraw my motion.
Okay, what we have here is a motion to amend the agenda to include an executive session at the end of this meeting pursuant to Idaho Code Section 67-23451F. The good faith reason being the need to discuss legal ramifications of illegal options for potential litigation in a time-sensitive manner.
Mr. Mayor, I'll make that motion.
Okay.
Second.
Okay. Wayne made the motion. Dan seconded. And I'll start with John.
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Aye. 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 And that has proved, so we will have executive session at the end of this regular meeting. Okay, now we'll go on to the consent agenda.
Mayor, I'd like to remove item G from the consent agenda, and then I will make a motion to approve the rest of it.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, Wayne's motion, or it's second, so can I start with you, Art, on everything but G?
Aye.
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 Okay, Wayne, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Item G is the wastewater treatment plant, Phase 5, pre-designed study contract amendment. And the reason I wanted this pulled is because this is, I think, a pretty important item that all the folks of Moscow be aware of what's going on. It has to do with the cooling of our effluent as it's discharged into Paradise Creek so that we can meet, first of all, the state of Washington standards, which are guided through EPA. I didn't think, Les, that it was really necessary to have this big slide presentation and all that, but if you could kind of just go into what we're looking at and our options, and so just kind of advise everybody as what's going on.
Certainly. The wastewater treatment plant for the city of Moscow operates under a permit that's established and issued by the Environmental Protection Agency out of Seattle. That permit stipulates what levels of pollutants, if you will, can be discharged from a wastewater treatment plant into the receiving water body, which is Paradise Creek. One of those items that is stipulated within that permit deals with temperature. What is the temperature of the water coming out of the wastewater treatment plant and going into the creek? The city has undertaken a number of improvement projects at the wastewater treatment plant to deal with a variety of issues that are within those regulations under that permit. Temperature is really the remaining one. And so we've been moving forward with efforts to ensure that we can meet temperature standards on a consistent basis. And as part of that, we've undertaken what we have titled the pre-design study for the wastewater treatment plant Phase 5 improvements. Now, that pre-design study is something that we have been working on the last couple of years. It looked at 17 different identified options for dealing with temperature coming out of the wastewater treatment plant, then reduced those to about 5 contenders, if you will, then actually developed a few hybrid options as well, and in the end came up with really 3 primary contenders for possible solutions to improvements for temperature at the treatment plant. Those three solutions all involve something called evaporative cooling, which uses a pond that stores the water for a period of time, uses the atmosphere and climatic conditions to cool that water before it is then handled and released. One of those options also includes a wetlands treatment facility. So the item that is before you this evening is an amendment to the contract that was issued to JUB for the pre-design study about 2 years ago. And that amendment will add some additional services to help the city with some pilot studies to be undertaken this summer to look at the evaporative cooling systems and a wetland system in our climate, in our situation, our soils, our plant types, things of that nature, to get a better handle on whether evaporative cooling and wetlands are truly effective cooling methods here in Moscow. And so the two pilot studies would be to bring in a evaporative cooling tower that would replicate a cooling pond, and to provide flow through an existing wetlands facility out near the treatment plant that could be monitored to then also assess the effects of a wetlands on that water or on water passing through it, both in terms of temperature and other constituents. So the item on your consent agenda is that modification of that contract support services from JUB to help us in performing those two pilot studies this summer.
Other questions for Les?
I do.
Walter's got one. Listen.
Les, what's the amount of the contract amendment?
I believe it sits at, make me look it up, 70. Total of $79,000, including a $5,000 management reserve.
Thank you.
Wayne?
Originally, my understanding on the cooling of the water was Paradise Creek itself had to meet a certain temperature standard, but from what I'm reading here, it's actually our effluent discharge temperature that we have to be able to control, and not so much as trying to change, how do I want to put this? We can only do so much to cool Paradise Creek. They came up with a temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, which is, about 64 degrees or so Fahrenheit. I guess my question, Les, is how did they come up with that temperature?
Yeah, there are actually two components. The first is the creek itself, what's a natural temperature within a water body of that nature. Now, each state sets standards for that. Idaho has its own, Washington has its own, and those are the standards that are then used when you look at point dischargers like the city of Moscow with a treatment plant where you have one pipe discharging to the creek. It's a point discharger. Looking at those kind of entities in terms of what temperature, effluent, or flow can they put into the creek. So for Paradise Creek, there was a study done in Idaho back in the 90s that said, here's the creek, here's what it can handle, here's what the habitat is, and here's what we want to be able to support in terms of habitat. Now, the bit of the oddity here is due to our proximity to the Washington state line, under federal regulations, we have to comply with the downstream state standards because of close proximity. So because our discharge is so close to the state line, in essence, we have to meet Washington standards, which are more stringent than Idaho. That's a standard that was set across the state of Washington for what's called a Class A water body, which is that it's actually an 18-degree temperature standard for really as a default temperature for most types of fish habitat throughout the state. So that's where the creek standard comes from. Then our standard for our effluent has to work within that. So we cannot discharge in a way that raises that temperature above that standard from the state of Washington.
So are we making an assumption then that at that period of time that the creek water is already at approximately the discharge temperature that we would be using?
Not necessarily.
It could be higher.
There are certainly times in the summer when the creek flows are very low, and temperatures are high, that the water temperature would exceed that 18 degrees
So my
C.
assumption would be that as Paradise Creek comes into the city limits of Moscow, it more than likely is higher than that temperature.
There are times when there's no flow coming into the city of
Okay.
Moscow.
The place I have a difficult time understanding is if we chose to not discharge whatsoever into Paradise Creek,
Yes.
if we used it for all purple pipe for irrigation purposes such as the University of Idaho, or it was all through percolation, through the ground, this type of thing, and there's no discharge in Paradise Creek, we would not be affecting Paradise Creek in any way, shape, or form. It would cross the state line at whatever temperature it had,
That's correct.
which would be higher than the 17 degrees Celsius, most likely.
At certain times of the year, that's true.
Now I have an issue with why we have to change the natural temperature of that water and spend the amount of money that we do. That was the point I wanted to make.
If I may, that's a question that's been raised a lot within the region. We were part of a watershed resource inventory area assessment done through Washington State over the last 10 years, and that was an item that was addressed repeatedly. And I can tell you that the Washington State Department of Ecology is studying Paradise Creek and the South Fork of the Palouse River to determine if that temperature standard is appropriate. And the preliminary findings that we're hearing from them is that it is probably not appropriate, and it should probably be higher. We're still waiting on the Department of Ecology to modify, or basically to finish their study and come up with a final recommendation to go through their state process to reset the temperature standard for the South Fork of Paradise Creek in the state of Washington. It may be 19 or 20 degrees, we're not sure yet, but their preliminary indications are that it's likely to change.
Thank you. Walter?
Thank you. Now he's got me going.
Got John going, too. He had his hand up.
Les, if the creek is at a high temperature, let's say for whatever reason it's coming through town at 100 degrees, I can't deal in centigrade, are we responsible for lowering the temp of the creek or not raising the, what are they measuring? Are they measuring our effluent or are they measuring the creek itself, irregardless of what we're putting into it?
They really measure both in that the Clean Water Act deals with temperature within water bodies in the United States. So they're looking at the creek temperature, okay, from a holistic perspective. What is it? What should it be? How can we get there collectively? For the city of Moscow, our only responsibility is to deal with our effluent. So that's what is monitored at our discharge pipe to make sure that we are meeting the standard that's set under our permit. If the creek is still too warm, that's not really our problem,
Okay.
because we're doing what we're required to do, and maybe other issues need to be dealt with.
Okay, thank you.
John, you had a question?
Are we going to spend this $80,000 before we know what the state of Washington is going to do about their temperature limits? Or are we going to wait until they have told us what the temperature limits are, see what we're doing, and then decide whether we do need to spend the money or not?
As far as the pilot studies, they are somewhat seasonally sensitive, so really we're looking for summer season. We need to check the ability of these two techniques to cool water during really July and August when the temperatures are highest and creek temperatures are up and creek flows are down. So we're tied into the seasonal aspect for doing pilot studies. The other thing to keep in mind is we need to continue to make progress towards improving our ability to treat temperature. And it's really regardless of what the state of Washington is doing. So the short answer is yes, we will spend this before they finish their process, because they're a little ways out yet. They have to finish their studies, and eventually it works its way through a legislative process to come up with any new standard.
So it's a necessary expenditure whether we spend it now or a year from now.
Right, and you know, part of it is figuring out what the capability of these systems are. So even if the standard does change, we then know what we need to build to meet perhaps a new standard if there's one set.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tom?
Thank you. I understand that the question before us is adopting the contract amendment agreement to test these two systems, either the cooling tower system or the wetland system. Of the 17 choices that we had, my favorite two were using more of the effluent, using a higher percentage, if not all of it, at least during those warm weather months, which would effectively remove the problem, or pumping it or piping it underground to take advantage of the natural cooling effect of the ground. We've talked about this before, right? Or perhaps even putting it in upstream somewhere so that we're, trying to take advantage of natural cooling of the ground and then perhaps using it later. Are those options completely off the table, or is there some opportunity for either using more of the effluent or using underground piping to help further bring down the temperature?
Well, at this point, I'd say none of the options are completely off the table. I mean, part of the idea of the study was to determine which ones were the most feasible, socially, economically,
Sure.
environmentally, right on down the line. And the ones that we're looking at, the final three, if you will, are the ones that really came out on top in those types of criteria assessments. One of those does include land application. And so essentially expanding what we're doing at the University of Idaho now to put more water onto irrigation in some form. For the most part, it would be in the vicinity of the treatment plant to keep the overall costs down. The idea of the kind of a geothermal exchange, that was one that we did look at fairly heavily as well. It had enough issues associated with cost and reliability that I think it's part of why it fell by the wayside in the overall assessments.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, with that, Mr. Mayor, I'll make a motion to accept item G on the consent agenda.
Okay.
I'll second.
John Wayne's motion, John's second. We will start with Art.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, that is done. It completes our consent agenda. Now we'll go to staff recognition reports. Gary Weidner.
We have none tonight, Your Honor.
None tonight on staff recognition. Okay, we'll move to item 3, mayor appointments. Right at the moment, we're reviewing applications. We have a number in process, but we have not made any decisions, but they will be coming before us pretty soon. So now I'm going to move on to public comment and mayor's response period. This is set for a 15-minute time limit, folks, for any member of the public to speak to the council. Just keep in mind you cannot speak on matters that's on the agenda tonight, not currently pending before the Planning and Zone Commission or the Board of Adjustment, and not subject to the pending enforcement actions, and not relative to a city personnel matter. As you come up, please state your name, address for the record, and limit remarks to 3 minutes. Seeing nobody rush to the podium, I will close it then, and we'll move on. The next thing on the agenda is a public hearing on Harvest Hills preliminary plat. Mike Ray will present, please.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
before we start, I need to mention as part of this process that prior to being elected to this body, I was on Planning and Zoning Commission where this application had to pass before it gets to the City Council. Anything I heard there is now a matter of the public record and accessible to any member of this body or the public. And as such, I think I can render a unbiased opinion and go forth and participate in this action.
Should be a wealth of knowledge for us, shouldn't you?
Thank you, Art. Mike, you can go ahead and present then, if you would, please.
Thank you, Your Honor, members of the council. Before you tonight, we have the preliminary plat for Harvest Hills addition to the city of Moscow. So, just to orient yourself to the subject property, outlined in red in the center of your screen, 24.7 acres, essentially east of Mountain View. We have the 3rd Street alignment here, which projects through the proposed subdivision, ends up tying in with the 3rd Street alignment with Rolling Hills 8th Edition. You have various single-family residential developments within the Rolling Hills additions to the south. You also have single-family residential development to the north, Mosier Estates, Skyview Estates. You also have residential development to the west of the subject property across Mountain View Road. And before we get into the Harvest Hills proposed preliminary plat tonight, I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to what's occurred so far on this property. So the property was annexed and rezoned in 2005, and that was from the Ag Forest designation to the Moderate Density Residential, which is our R2 designation. There was a preliminary plat for Windfall Hills, which was the former name of this proposed subdivision. Included 77 single-family residential lots, about an average lot size of 9,700 square feet, which equates to about 4.5 dwelling units per acre of net density. And the roadway alignments were virtually the same as what's proposed before you tonight with the Harvest Hills addition. And this was approved on August 1st, 2005. And so this is just a sample plat map of what was approved. As you can tell, there's the 3rd Street alignment, which projects through the subdivision. You also have a cul-de-sac here to the west. You also have a local residential street. Amber Court is what it's proposed in the plat tonight. Ends up going in a one-way, 20-foot wide drive in a circular fashion around a piece of park property. In 2006, the applicant submitted a PUD to go along with the preliminary plat for Windfall Hills. That included sample home elevations with similar architectural style throughout the development. He also had reduced front yard setbacks, which at the time were 25 feet for that R2 zone. The PUD effectively reduced those to 10 feet. And for that, the developer proposed to provide additional landscaping and public amenities within the subdivision, and this was approved on July 19th, 2006. And so around that time, in 2008, the city and the developer had entered into a discussion regarding a communications pedestal, a Verizon pedestal that required relocation as part of this plat. And at the time, the city was contemplating a road improvement project on the portion of Mountain View Road, which included the frontage of Windfall Hills subdivision. The city had a desire to extend Jansen Street to Damon Street, which was currently undeveloped and provided no connection with the Jansen Street extension. So there came the 2008 MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that the city and the developer entered into and executed by City Council on April 21st, 2008. And the gist of that was that the city would contribute up to $50,000 towards the communication pedestal relocation and be responsible for Jansen extension, just the underground utilities. The developer was responsible for Mountain View Road frontage improvements, which included bicycle and pedestrian path on that east side of the street and roadway improvements for the Jansen Street extension. And then in July 21st of 2008, the final plat and the development agreement were approved by council. And it just so happened that some of the conditions within the 2008 MOU were not satisfied, which brought us to an updated MOU, herein called the 2009 MOU, whereas the city was responsible for improvements to Mountain View Road, which included the paving, curb gutter, and the drainage system. The communication pedestal, in the time being, was relocated by Verizon. So now the developer within this 2009 MOU was responsible for Jansen Street extension, which included underground utilities to occur in Phase 1 of the subdivision. At the time, there was 2 phases of the proposed Windfall Hills subdivision. Also required to dedicate street right-of-way of the 25-foot and a 35-foot easement on the east side of Mountain View Road. That's a street, pedestal, and bicycle path, pedestrian and bicycle path that currently exists out there today. And the final plat was to be recorded on June 3rd, 2009. Well, since that time, the city has since constructed the agreed-upon improvements to Mountain View Road, and the developer has dedicated a portion of Mountain View right-of-way. The property originally had gone to the center of the street. So there's a right-of-way dedication as well as that 25-foot wide and 35-foot wide pathway easements on the east side of Mountain View. Well, the developer never filed the Windfall Hills final plat or completed the Jansen Street extension, and the final plat approval expired, which required the developer to start basically from the beginning of the subdivision plat process. So that brings us to the proposal before you tonight, Harvest Hills Edition. Once again, we've got the subject property, center of your screen there.
Mike, if I may interrupt you before you go further.
Sure.
Just to get to this point and make sure I'm clear, did the city ever spend the $50,000 that they committed?
We did not. Verizon, under a franchise, relocated within the right-of-way, so that did not, I don't believe the city participated in that.
Okay, and secondly, if I understand, this property is a vacant field, unplatted, no commitments on it by the city or a developer at this moment.
Just the previous MOUs that were entered into, and
they're no longer operative?
they're recorded.
They would still be valid.
So
They would
those
still be good.
the memorandum of understanding is still in force?
There was,
2009.
Okay.
it went on to the buyer.
So those move forward with the land to the new buyer?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just looking at the subject property one more time, we have contour lines, topographical lines. These represent 2 feet of elevation change for every black line. You also have some gray lines in there as well that represent 10 feet of elevation change. So you're looking at slopes upwards, 15, 20% on that south side adjacent to that hill. You also have a large valley that runs down the center of the property. Looking at the floodplain in the area, the yellow line represents the floodway, and you can see portions of the 100-year floodplain, which is represented by the blue line. You can tell that it just basically goes across the northwest corner of the property, and as you will see, doesn't affect any of the lots, just the parkland, portion of the parkland dedication. Looking at the current zoning of the area, the subject property is that moderate density residential, which is R2. Single-family zone. You can tell from the northwest, south, and east, all that property is also designated R2. So taking a look at what our zoning code says about the R2 zone, it says that it's moderate density residential zone appropriate where the following circumstances are present, where single-family dwellings predominate, the terrain is not harshly irregular, and smaller lot sizes can be accommodated without extensive earthwork. Utilities and other public facilities are adequate for the densities allowed. Existing lot development patterns and policies embodied in the plan will also guide application of this zoning district. So allowable uses are basically just single-family residential dwellings, and typically we observe densities in that zone at around 3 to 4 units per net acre. Minimum lot size 7,000 square feet, and the minimum width is 60 feet. Brings us to the Harvest Hills preliminary plat. As you can tell, it was similar to the Windfall Hills plat that you looked at earlier. Basically, the 3rd Street alignment. 3rd Street is currently designated in this alignment as an urban collector street. You have Jordan Court cul-de-sac here to the west. You also have the 3rd Street alignment that heads east, ends up going north on the Jansen Street alignment. From Jansen Street, we also have Amber Court, which is a local neighborhood street. Basically consists of, at the end of it, one of the proposed parkland parcels and a 20-foot wide travel aisle in the street that basically circles the park property. You also have various other parkland dedication. You have the 20-foot, 5-foot wide pedestrian bicycle easement here on the east. You also have the 35-foot wide pedestrian bicycle easement, as well as stormwater detention parcel here to the northwest.
Tom, did you have a question for Mike earlier?
I just was trying to figure out when the name change occurred. Is that just with this new?
This is a brand new proposal.
Okay.
Yep, the former plat was basically null and void because they failed to record that up at the county.
Got it.
So,
Dan?
So, Mike, stormwater retention areas count for parkland dedication?
I think it'd be a question for Dwight, but typically it's the net developable area, so it'd just be the lot size, the lots within the development, so excluding the streets, as well as those stormwater detention parcels.
Anybody else have questions for Mike? Art, would you?
You might mention the pedestrian access at the far east end.
Sure. Yeah, we also have a 20-foot wide right-of-way here at the east end. Failed to mention we have Mosier Park, which is approximately 5-acre park here to the east. And part of this 20-foot wide circular drive around the cul-de-sac park here is a 20-foot wide right-of-way with 5-foot wide easements on either side. And that carries utilities as well as pedestrian bicyclists to the Mosier Park property and gives it access off of Amber Court.
How wide is that path, Mike, from the cul-de-sac turnaround to that park?
It's 20 feet wide with 5-foot easements on either side,
All right.
so an effective 30-foot width. And it does have 3 utilities in it and serves as pedestrian bicycle access.
Okay. Tom?
It looks like there are several lots between the proposed preliminary plat and that are on the south end of that previous plat that have writing on them that I can't read. Can you?
Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. There's actually a pedestrian bicycle easement that was part of, you're referring to right here?
No, I'm referring to. No, sorry. I'm trying to figure out the access to these lots right here. They look like lots, but
Yeah.
I don't see how.
They had done lots of consolidation, so essentially they're part of these properties on Mosier.
Okay.
So these owners of houses on Mosier ended up purchasing property at the rear, and under our zoning code, if it's under common ownership, we essentially recognize it as one lot, even though it may appear as a couple different lots there. But essentially, the owners own those of the
All right.
properties on Mosier.
Thanks.
Yeah. So we have 75 lots within this proposal, and they range from a little over 7,000 square feet in size, which is our minimum for R2, to about 19,496 square feet in size on the higher end. Average lot size is about 10,500 square feet, equates to about 3.75 units per net acre. And just wanted to take a look at average lot sizes within the vicinity. Mosier Estates 1 through 4 to the north. The average lot size just a little over 12,000 square feet. Skyview Estates about 13,500 square feet. Damon subdivision 10,374 square feet. We got Rolling Hills 6, which is about 11,250 square feet. Rolling Hills 7th. About the same, almost 12,000 square feet for average size. And then Rolling Hills South to the, Rolling Hills 8th to the south, the least of all the subdivisions, about 9,659 square feet in size for all the lots within that development. So I had mentioned earlier about the Jansen Street extension. Just wanted to delineate that on the map for you, outlined in red here. Essentially connects the proposed Harvest Hills subdivision through the Jansen Street extension. We have Jansen Street extension, and then it ends up connecting into Damon there to the north, currently undeveloped. And so on this, I just have geo-reference the plat map so you can see the road alignments and how they tie in. Once again, you got Rolling Hills 8th, which 3rd Street ends up transecting. 3rd Street alignment ends up going northeast, eventually connecting into D Street to the north, at least shown on our thoroughfare plan to do so. So that brings us to the thoroughfare plan. You can see the dash green line in the center is what we had anticipated to be the 3rd Street alignment. Once again, heading down to Rolling Hills 8th, eventually turns 90 degrees and heads north. Eventually we'll connect with D Street, which is designated as an arterial. Wanted to take a look at current water service, which exists in a 10-inch water main, which is currently extended into the property as part of just that portion of 3rd Street that's already constructed by the city. An 8-inch main is proposed to be extended in all other streets and to the eastern subdivision boundary. A sanitary sewer system consists of an 8-inch main, which currently exists in the 3rd Street alignment, which was put in by the previous developer of the Windfall Hills development. And a new main will be extended through Amber Court to the subdivision's eastern boundary, which essentially ties in with the Mosier Park property. Storm sewer is basically conveyed through a new storm sewer line to that detention pond that I had mentioned earlier in that northwest corner of the proposed development by Paradise Creek. And eventually the stormwater detention pond ends up discharging into Paradise Creek. Just wanted to go through the street network briefly. Mountain View Road is designated as a minor arterial within our thoroughfare plan. It consists of a 48-foot wide roadway in this section, 2 travel lanes, bike lanes, curb gutter, sidewalk on both sides of the street. 3rd Street, once again, it's a collector. Proposed to be 35-foot roadway with no on-street parking at this time. Then you have the local neighborhood streets, Jordan Court, Jansen Street, Amber Court, which are 28-foot wide roadways with on-street parking on just one side of the street. So, brings us to the Jansen Street extension. This is that undeveloped portion I had outlined in red. And this, the developer is required to construct this section per that 2009 Memorandum of Understanding that we discussed previously.
If I may, Mayor.
Go ahead, Walter.
And that 2009 MOU was curb, gutter, sidewalks, pavement, and utilities?
Yeah, the first iteration, the city was responsible for the underground utilities. The 2009 MOU required the developer to construct everything, above ground and below ground.
Thank you.
Talk about the Amber Court cul-de-sac again. That's a one-way travel lane. It is a 28-foot wide section of right-of-way, but it's only proposed to be paved to a 25-foot or 20-foot width with no on-street parking. And this is, once again, that 20-foot wide pedestrian right-of-way corridor with a 5-foot easements on both sides access the Mosier Park property. That brings us to Jordan Court cul-de-sac. This is the cul-de-sac in the northwest corner. The applicant is currently proposing that to be a 60-foot diameter. Within our street standards, we have a 60-foot diameter cul-de-sac and an 80-foot diameter cul-de-sac with on-street parking in that 80-foot. The 2009 International Fire Code requires a 96-foot diameter in order to turn around fire apparatus. And this is only if the roadway exceeds 150 feet in length, which the current proposal before you today exceeds the 150 feet in length for Jordan Court. So the fire department, unless the applicant could get that distance down, stand by a requirement of the 96-foot wide cul-de-sac diameter. And there is a memo from Joe Williams, the fire marshal, attached to your packet tonight. Just wanted to point out the pedestrian easement that exists between the proposed Harvest Hills subdivision and Rolling Hills 8th addition to the south. Essentially on the common lot lines of 8 and 9 of Block 4. I have it outlined in purple here. Connects, and it's basically a 10-foot wide pedestrian easement, which ends up connecting Amber Court with 3rd Street. And the reason it's there is just the overly long block length of Amber Court. I wanted to go through the parkland dedication requirements for this development. It currently contains 20 acres of net developable land within the Harvest Hills proposed subdivision. Within the R2 zone, that requires 5% dedication of the net developable area, which results in a requirement of 1 acre to be dedicated as part of this development. And the applicant right now is proposed to dedicate parkland in 3 different locations. They had subtracted 1 moving through the process, but I'll go over all 4 of those right now. The one's 3,333 square foot dedication, which is the 25-foot linear pathway on the east side of Mountain View. There's also the 35-foot linear pathway on the east side of Mountain View that currently exists, and that encompasses 22,491 square feet. You also have the cul-de-sac park at the end of Amber Court, the large teardrop-shaped park in the center of that one-way drive. You also have a 10,541 square foot strip of land east of lots 1, 2, 13, 14. This is adjacent to the Mosier Park property. And so the cumulative of those equates to about 1.27 acres. We discovered that there was an initial parkland calculation error, which resulted in the applicant submitting a proposal that's basically 0.27 acres above what the requirement for dedication is. And the applicant had since testified at the Planning and Zoning Commission hearing that they were going to eliminate the 10,541 square foot dedication, the one that's adjacent to Mosier Park, in order to get the number closer to 1 acres of parkland dedication. So I just wanted to go through where these dedications are. This is the 25-foot wide one here on the east side of Mountain View. We've got the 35-foot wide one here that ends up going adjacent to Paradise Creek. We have the teardrop-shaped park here at the center of the one-way drive on Amber Court. We also have, this is the one adjacent to Mosier Park, which the applicants testified that they're planning on removing to get closer to that 1 acre dedication requirement. So this was reviewed by the Transportation Commission at the regular meeting, and that happened on December 12, 2013. The recommendation the Commission wanted to convey regarding the plat was that the city should consider any measures that could be taken to accommodate McDonald Elementary School students that are likely to traverse the plat in the north-south direction along Jansen Street. So that's essentially coming from subdivisions to the south, heading south to north there, trying to make their way to McDonald Elementary School on D. Planning and Zoning Commission conducted a public hearing, and that happened on December 11th, 2013. The recommendation was for approval of the preliminary plat request with 3 conditions. The first one is that the applicant shall construct the undeveloped portion of Jansen Street, including all the underground utilities from the northern subdivision boundary of the proposed Harvest Hills subdivision to Damon Street before any building permits are to be issued for Phase 1 of the subdivision. Essentially, the Phase 1 dividing line is right there at the Jansen Street division. And this is pursuant to the June 2009 MOU. Second condition recommended by Planning and Zoning Commission is the applicant shall increase the diameter of Jordan Court cul-de-sac to 96 feet to meet the requirements of the 2009 International Fire Code. Third, the applicant shall comply with all City of Moscow development standards. And then, at the time, the Commission also expressed concern regarding the lack of on-street parking on 3rd Street, since it's currently designated as an urban collector with 2 bike lanes, 28-foot wide street. There's currently no on-street parking proposed on that 3rd Street alignment. The Commission had heard some public testimony, as well as public testimony included in your packet, with concern about the lack of on-street parking, as well as lack of adjacent local neighborhood streets to provide the on-street parking for that 3rd Street alignment. You have Jordan Court, which is fairly small in length. You have Mountain View Road, which is an arterial, currently doesn't have any on-street parking. And then the next nearest on-street parking would be further on to the east on Amber Court and Jansen Street within the development. So they made no formal recommendation, but they did express some concern, and that's included within the Roman Criteria and Standards document before you tonight. So Planning and Zoning Commission essentially came away with 3 recommended conditions, 3 of which were of the 5 original conditions recommended by staff. Coming from the Public Works Department, the requirement that the applicant shall construct the undeveloped portion of Jansen Street, including all the underground utilities from the northern subdivision boundary of the proposed Harvest Hills subdivision to Damon Street, before any building permits are to be issued for Phase 1 of the subdivision, pursuant to that 2009 MOU. Development standards was the same as Planning and Zoning Commission. This is one they chose not to adopt, which is the applicant shall provide a minimum of 60 feet for any utility easement that has 2 or more utilities within it.
How many feet did you say?
30 feet.
Okay.
Minimum 30
60.
feet.
I think you said 60.
Oh, sorry. Did I? Yeah. I apologize.
I'll get to you in a second, John.
And it's basically just within that Jordan Court cul-de-sac. There's 2 utilities and a proposed 20-foot wide utility easement. Brings us to the fire department. The applicant shall increase the diameter of Jordan Court cul-de-sac to 96 feet to meet the requirements of the 2009 International Fire Code if Jordan Court is greater than 150 feet in length from the center radius. And so, since the Planning and Zoning Commission hearing, we have met with the applicant numerous times to try to get the Jordan Court cul-de-sac issue resolved. They ended up moving the alignment up on the 60-foot diameter cul-de-sac and hopefully getting the 150 feet in length needed in order to not require the 96-foot wide radius. But, you know, we had met and discussed this multiple times, and we're not able to come to a consensus, so they're still exploring options about how to, you know, shift the cul-de-sac from the center of the radius of the Jordan Court cul-de-sac to where the street connects with 3rd Street in order to make that 150 feet in length. So the 96-foot requirement is not a recommendation. Brings us to the parks.
I can wait.
I'll let him finish with his recommendations, John.
Recommendation that the Planning and Zoning Commission chose not to go with their recommendation is that the applicant shall not be allowed to place any restrictions on what type of park would be developed in the 12,112 square foot Amber Court cul-de-sac park. And with that, certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
John Weber had a question, John?
Yeah, the applicant shall comply with all City of Moscow development standards. Where do those standards come from? And are they a moving target?
Well, they'd be contained within our subdivision ordinance, our zoning code, as well as all the public works requirements that are currently adopted by City Council, street standards, just, you know, all the codes that we continue to work with that are reviewed and adopted by City Council.
So if the applicant and the city sits down to discuss this and come to an agreement, that agreement holds on both sides?
Well, for our City of Moscow development standards, you know, that is a requirement, and so any flexibility that we could provide, we certainly try to do, but when it comes down to it, you know, unless the council wishes to impose, you know, a different standard, those are the standards that we have adopted and we have to go off of.
Okay. Thank you.
Art, I'll go with Art first.
Yeah. Have you had any discussions with the developers about the 3rd Street and parking?
Yeah, we met with Scott a couple times. I think he can certainly speak for his client, but I don't believe that there's really any progress made in trying to incorporate any on-street parking within the 3rd Street alignment.
What's the distance represented by 3rd Street between Mountain View and the intersection of Jansen?
It's around 1,700 lineal feet.
So, third of a mile or so?
Yeah, correct.
Walter?
Mike, what does the city consider a residential block length? 1,700 feet's not a block. What do y'all consider to be a normal block, if there is such a thing?
600 feet.
Bill?
The adopted block length standard is 660 feet. 660 feet is the adopted block length standard.
Okay.
In this situation, because of the adjacent development that already exists to the north and the south, there is no likelihood or any ability for any cross streets until you reach Jansen Street. But our traditional block length standard is 660 unless terrain or other conditions impede that.
Thank you.
Wayne, you had a question?
Couple of questions. Mike, first of all, did I understand you to say that the developer has been able or has not been able to come up with a reconfiguration of Jordan Court to get to that 150-foot length?
I believe in the recent iteration, they're sticking with the 60-foot wide cul-de-sac, but they've been able to reduce the length of Jordan Court to 150 feet from the intersection of 3rd to the center of the radius of Jordan Court, and Mr. Becker could certainly speak to that.
So we're understood then that if in fact you get it reconfigured to 150 feet from the radius, that it'll be at 60 feet, but if you can't do it, it still has to be 96 feet. That's probably not a bargaining chip, right?
Your Honor?
Gary?
I think at some point, we're starting to question what the applicant may be putting out as their argument, or whether they...
And we'll hear from that person
So
pretty soon.
it seems to me that perhaps the public hearing ought to be open to take that testimony, and then the city council follow up
Okay,
based upon that.
very good. Walter had a question.
I had
The same
one more,
thing.
Bill.
Was it
Just
similar
one
to that, Wayne?
That was on the right-of-way, the 30-foot easement for utility right-of-way. Staff wants 30 feet, but I see what planning and zoning recommended 20 feet.
Well, they had just not included that within their recommendation, so that wasn't one of the recommended conditions. It was still carried over from staff, and Mr. McDonald's probably prepared to speak
Well, then I
about.
guess my question is, if I appropriate time to ask it, is why do you need 30 feet? That's an awful wide just for utility easement, is it not?
Well, actually, when you start thinking about the access to a utility, if you need to go in and replace or repair that utility, it's actually not all that wide if there are multiple utilities. Generally speaking, when you think about a utility that's traversing through a yard or between houses, and you've got to get a backhoe in there, and possibly even a dump truck in there, generally speaking, you want to have about 10 feet on either side of the utility line. So that's why one utility typically sees a 20-foot easement. When you go to 2 utilities or more, generally speaking, we're looking for a 30-foot easement in some fashion. With 3 utilities, being water, sewer, and storm, 2 of those can be a little closer together, and so you can make it work within the 30. With 2 utilities, you can make it work within the 30. 1, you can go down to 20. So it's generally just an access issue and being able to get in and operate a backhoe, make the swing of the hoe, and bring in any kind of materials that you might need to bring in if you're looking at a replacement or maintenance repair of some sort.
Tom, you had a
I
question?
just have one clarifying question. Jensen is shown spelled both with an E and with an O in your material.
Which is
In
correct.
In O is...
It's an O?
O.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions to Mike before we open the public hearing?
I just need a clarification if I can, Mr.
Okay,
Mayor.
Wayne?
Well, Mike, back to this 30-foot, or whoever wants to answer it. You said it wasn't part of planning and zoning's recommendation. However, the motion was to approve the application, including all staff recommendations except 1D. 1D was the requirement for the 30-foot easement.
Reading from the minutes.
1D was the staff's recommendation for 30-foot easement.
I don't know where you're reading from.
Oh, that's from the planning and zoning minutes.
Well, Wayne, the planning and zoning had their criteria and their recommendations. After that hearing, city staff added things on their recommendations too, which we don't need to necessarily take. Once we go through the public hearing process, we can make the decisions on, or I said the body here can make the decisions on what recommendations it wants to move forward with.
Right.
So that will be in front of us.
That might be incorrect in the minutes. The approval document, the relevant criteria and standards, which is just right before that, would list, the last page, it'll list what the recommended conditions are. They're essentially all staff's recommendations, with the exception of the parkland preference coming from Dwight, as well as the easement width of 30 feet. And so,
Okay.
Okay? I think we're good, Mike, so I think we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. I'll open the public hearing. I'd like to hear from the applicant, please, or whoever is representing the applicant. Please state your name and address and who you are, what you do.
Hi, I'm Scott Becker with Hodge & Associates, 405 South Washington, here in Moscow. I'd like to address that easement issue. The easement, I think just to throw it out as a blanket statement that we need a 30-foot easement every time there's 2 utilities in a trench, I think might be some overkill. In this area, it's a very short run. It's very accessible from both ends, from the cul-de-sac or from the parkland. So I think a 20-foot easement is plenty wide to get a Mini X or even a backhoe in there to dig it out and work on a utility. Another consideration is I don't recall ever having to dig up a PVC utility lately. Any sewer that we have that we've gone to PVC, they don't wear out or break down that fast. So you're looking at maybe digging it up once every 75 years. That seems like a huge waste of space to take a 30-foot chunk of land when we can do it in a 20. So we'd like you to consider making that easement a 20-foot easement as we show on the plat. The other issue, the cul-de-sac, we can move the cul-de-sac towards 3rd Street and get the center of the cul-de-sac within 150 feet of 3rd Street. So talking to Joe Williams, he wasn't sure if that was good enough or not. So I think that's considered less than 100, or we can get it less than 150 feet. So anything under 150 feet, they say does not need a turnaround. So it's kind of splitting hairs whether you go to the where you count your 150 feet to. But if we go to the center of the cul-de-sac, we can reach that point. We looked at some other alternatives. We looked at a hammerhead. It just didn't fit into what we wanted to do. It didn't look very nice. If we go to a larger cul-de-sac, it just eats up all the land and almost becomes undevelopable. So we'd really like to, with your consideration, we would go with the 60-foot cul-de-sac radius. Okay. My third point, and maybe I didn't say this earlier, Mike did a fantastic job taking us through the history of this project. He did a great job. Our concern also was with parking on 3rd Street. We're providing a road section that's wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic and parking on both sides. Now, since the city's calling it a collector, they're saying, no, we can't have parking on there. It has to be something else. If the city wants to truly make it a collector, would they entertain the idea of participating in some widening during development rather than widening somewhere in the future? That way, if we do it just as 2 lanes of traffic and parking, I think it'd be a great street. It would slow down. It would work as a traffic calming, slow traffic down. But if we want to make it wider, add bike lanes, would the city entertain the idea of participating with that addition? So those were my concerns for this.
Okay.
Do you have any questions?
Well, we may bring you back up here pretty soon,
absolutely.
Scott, because we're going to hear from some other folks.
Okay.
So if you want to sit down, I would entertain anybody that is in favor of this application. Please step forward, state your name. Give you 3 minutes. Where you live at?
I'm Phil Ryan Gens. I own and farm the property. I live at 620 East Palouse River Drive here in Moscow. I think Scott's addressed some of the engineering considerations. I wanted to hit it from a little bit different angle on a few of them. On the parking, when we went to the Planning and Zoning Commission a month ago, there were some concerns expressed about having the road...
Could you pull the mic a little closer?
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. About having no parking along that stretch. And it is quite a long stretch. And afterward, Scott and I looked at it, and we can see that there's a consideration there. If someone has a party, it's going to be hard for them to have enough places for their friends to come over and park when it's quite a distance from 3rd Street as well as quite a distance from Amber Court. And so we would certainly consider having that so that there was a lane of traffic in each direction as well as parking on either side. But as soon as you do that, within that road section, then you're using the portion of the road that was previously, in our previous proposal, had a bike lane in each direction, now would have a lane of traffic in each direction as well as parking on either side. So there are two alternatives. One, travel in each direction, bike lanes in each direction, or with essentially the same road width, we could accommodate parking on each side, but essentially it would offset in the same road width, it would offset the bike lanes. So really what we're trying to do is come to what the best understanding of a good design is and what would accommodate the people that are living there and the city of Moscow the best. And it would appear at this point that parking on either side is probably the superior design within that road width. The second thing I wanted to address, and Scott's already addressed this to some measure, is the easement. On the far east side of the property where we have three utilities going through to the park, we have no qualms about putting a 30-foot easement there. And it makes sense that if somebody needs to dig down to a utility to service it, that there needs to be adequate room to do that. We have no qualms about that. I don't have the slide up here, but if you look at the way that things are laid out over there by Jordan Court, it's a very short distance. There's two utilities. One is sanitary sewer. The other is stormwater. They're spaced 5 feet apart. And in the distant event that would need to be serviced, if we had a 30-foot easement there, we're leaving quite a small amount of building pad on each of those adjacent lots. So what we're asking is that we would be allowed to put a 20-foot easement there because it would increase the quality of life for the people that are in both of those lots for a long period of time, considering the amount of extra room that's required for the easements. We think this is the better design alternative considering how short that easement is. The third thing I wanted to address is right there on Jordan Court as well. I believe that the length of that street under our design proposal to the center of the radius of that cul-de-sac is 161 feet. So as you can see, we're about 11 feet beyond where the threshold is, where it would kick us into having that 96-foot diameter. So we're quite close to that length. And so what I would prefer to do would be to go ahead and keep it at the 161 feet and at the 60-foot diameter. In the event that a fire truck would need to come in there, we looked at various design alternatives, putting a hammerhead in there and whatnot. And the other design alternatives, for instance, a hammerhead turnaround there would meet the fire requirements. However, it ends up being, in our opinion, a far less safe scenario, because if every day when someone comes into that cul-de-sac to turn around, they're having to do a three-point turn. So you're talking about a number of three-point turns in there every day simply to accommodate a design that meets the fire requirements. What we're asking for is to be allowed to go 11 feet over what the design requirement is with the 60-foot. If we open that up to 96 feet, we take enough out of each of those adjacent lots that we render them far less usable for the ultimate builder on that lot. And in the event that the fire department did need to come in there, we don't consider the additional 11 feet of length to be so compelling that we can't go with this design. The fourth thing I want to address, and very briefly, is something that came up earlier about the park that's in the end of Amber Court. I had proposed that I would be willing to participate with the city in some of the design and some of the funding to build that park. And so in the notes from the city, it said something to the effect that the design ultimately comes down to the city, and I have no qualms with that whatsoever. Ultimately, the land is dedicated to the city, and ultimately the design is entirely the city's decision. I would like to put forward some design alternatives. It's entirely up to the city at the end of the day what they decide to do. And at the end of the day, if I can help participate in the design as well as helping to fund so that that park gets built sooner rather than later, I'm willing to participate in that capacity, but at the same time knowing that it is dedicated land and it is the city's decision in the end, and I'm fine with that.
Okay, thank
I'm
you.
willing to address any questions if you have them.
We will, questions will come up in a bit. I think we're going to keep going with the public hearing,
Okay.
Because you're going to get a chance to come back up and talk. Additional, in favor of the applicant, please come up.
My name is Rafiq Itani. We own Rolling Hills, and I'm a licensed civil engineer.
What's your address, Mr. Itani? Your address, sir?
Southwest 1515 Wadley Drive, Pullman, Washington.
Thank you.
Yeah. And as I said, I'm a licensed civil engineer. I'm a faculty emeritus at WSU. And we've been working in Moscow since 1995. We developed all of Rolling Hills. We've gone through a lot of transitions, some of it that was so positive that I was really excited about it. City of Moscow, city streets used to be 37 feet wide. It was parking on both sides and a sidewalk on one side. And if you want to see that standard drive, Rolling Hill Drive, that's the first street that we did. And it's huge. The city street did not require that kind of standards. And then the city council at that time got really very thoughtful about the conditions, said, let's not pave America again. When you put a big street and wide street, you got to maintain it. You got to shed the water, storm water from it. You got to detain that water instead of have it infiltrate. So they made all the streets in Moscow, city streets, 29 feet. And they put planter strip and sidewalks on both sides, and parking. I believe the parking is on both sides now for a city, on one side. It's very, very pleasant street, beautiful when it's fully developed. You can drive 6th Street from Mountain View, and that is the new standards. Unfortunately, they didn't do anything about arterials. I mean, I work in Pullman too. I have 150 acres there that I develop. And the city of Pullman is interesting in the sense that, you know, it's similar to Moscow. The volumes that you're dealing with is not that substantial. It's not like Spokane. It's not like Seattle, where sometimes we confuse width of a street with the volume that it can take. All that you do when you have a wide street is encourage people to speed, and that's the problem we have in Pullman. And right in Pullman, it's interesting that we have one street there that I developed. It's 34 foot wide, parking on both sides, and it collects as much traffic from the hills as much as 3rd Street extension from Mountain View. And we have no problem with volume, not a problem, we have a problem with speed. And people are speeding, but we don't have any problem with volume. We developed, I'm sure Les McDonald was engineer in Pullman. He can elaborate on some of the stuff I'm saying. On the other hand, Crestview in Pullman is a 40-foot collector. And the city has a standard there in Moscow, in Pullman, that if a developer is required to do any streets over and beyond what he or she would be required to put in for a normal city street, the city participate. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to have the same standard there, but that's the way it is, you know. Because development is basically, a developer is in business, you know. And if we live in a hilly country, if you ask me to put real wide street, you know, everything is going to be reflected in the cost of development, and then therefore, you know, things get a little bit expensive. I am very, very concerned about 3rd Street. 3rd Street is 35 feet, no parking on both sides, and I don't know where, and this area where 3rd Street goes in is all R2, meaning residential, no commercial, nothing. And how much can you generate traffic on 3rd Street for it to be 50 feet or 40 feet or whatever?
Mr. Itani, could you kind of wrap it up, please?
Pardon?
Could you wrap it up, sir, so we
Yes.
can listen to other folks?
And therefore, I would say parking is essential, and some look about the street standard need to be done. Finally, I want to talk about the easement between lots to access the utilities. Now, we put those big easements, and we're required to pave them sometime. And the paving is about, 12 feet wide. And so you end up with so much on the side that you really, I don't see the reason for 30. I beg to differ here. I don't see a reason for a 30-foot easement between lots, which is cutting into the lots and causing more cost. And that's all I have to say.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Additional testimony in favor of the applicant? Okay, I will take testimony, general testimony, or testimony against the applicant. Please come up, state your name, address, if you'd like. Going once, going twice. No one's going to come up. I'll go ahead and close the public hearing. I'll leave it over to the council. John.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've sat in this chair, and so, and I'm getting older. But we are talking about a preliminary plat. How many plats before we get to the final plat? Or is that something that is dictated by the give and take between the city, the various departments, and the developer?
Bill, you want to answer that, please? Bill Belknap.
So, John, if I understand the question, the preliminary plat is reviewed in the public hearing, and the council makes a decision on the preliminary plat this evening, typically. The applicant would then go back and prepare the final plat document that would reflect the decision of the council this evening and any conditions of approval that the council imposed. That final plat then would go back through the Planning and Zoning Commission, they'd review it, and then it would come to the city council for the council's final approval. So there's no other, you go from preliminary to final, but there is one review step by P&Z, and then it comes to the council. It is not a public hearing, though, at the final plat. So this is the last public hearing that would be held on the subdivision. The final plat is really just an administrative review and approval to ensure that's in conformance with the council's decision.
So in effect, we have to make the decision on the parking and the easement at this meeting. All right.
If I may, there are some items that potentially you could defer to have staff work with the applicant to potentially resolve an issue sometimes, depending upon the scale of that issue. But I think, those items you've identified are probably things that the council either needs to decide tonight. The council always has the option to table it if additional information needs to be developed, or further answers need to be brought forward before the council. So you don't have to decide tonight. You can table it if something warranted that. But most often, the council does decide on the evening that the preliminary plat is reviewed.
Wayne?
Need the chief to come up. Fire chief, I got a question for him.
Okay. Chief Ed, would you come up? Ed Button, our fire chief.
What do you think? Good evening, Mayor and council members. Ed Button, fire chief.
Okay, question is then, we have a fire code that requires 96 feet if it's 150 feet or more in depth, street, correct?
If it's 150 feet and greater, then it requires some sort of a turning appliance, like what was also mentioned, like the T. There's some options that are outlined in the fire code.
Now you've
And
got
then-
me confused. I
Well,
thought
it was
if
mentioned also.
150 feet or more, it had to
Like
be
the
96
hammerhead,
feet.
sometimes, well, it's referred to as hammerhead. It looks like a T as well. A hammerhead turnaround.
Look, listen to my question.
Okay.
If it's a cul-de-sac, and it's 150 feet or more in depth, it has to be 96 feet. Is that correct?
I believe there's some options.
It's an option?
There's
I thought that was fire code.
Yes, there needs to be some type of a turning accommodation for apparatus. One, if I may, additionally add.
So if we leave it tonight with whatever design they come up with has to meet with the approval of the fire department. Does that work?
That's part of the process.
Okay. Thank you.
Walter?
Question for the
Thanks,
city,
Ed.
for the city attorney or for Gary Reedner. I remember a city attorney's comment, city councils can do what they want to do. We can override that fire code, can we not?
You can make a reasoned decision if you're going to make a decision against it. I mean, you can, but you're going to want to make a reasoned decision.
Okay.
But you're going to want to abide by, usually by the fire code, or the fire marshal. He's your expert. The fire marshal also has just a little bit of discrepancy or discretion in, his decisions if he can justify it and make a finding, why he wants to vary from that. So it doesn't really create a precedent if they do vary from that. But generally, fire codes were there for health and safety.
Just wanted to help Wayne understand our hands are not tied totally.
Go ahead, Walter, continue, and I'll get there.
I think I saw Bill hands, Mayor.
Bill?
I just had one minor clarification to the way Wayne phrased the question. You have to be, if you're over 150 feet, that's when that fire turnaround, not if you're at 150 feet or greater. I just wanted to clarify.
150 feet and 1 inch.
Correct. If you're over 150 feet in length, then a turnaround is required of some fashion.
Hang on a second, Walter had
Pursuing the same thing, and that's 150 feet to the face of the curb at the far end of the cul-de-sac in this case.
After further discussion, the fire department has indicated that they would go to the center point of the radius of the cul-de-sac, so the curb line on 3rd Street, where the intersecting street departs 3rd, to the center radius point of that cul-de-sac. That is the distance that we had been working to have the applicant shorten the length of that roadway to get that center radius point to be less than 150 feet. If that was the case, then the fire department was comfortable that was the end of the road. Essentially, you are now turning back around that center radius point, and so that roadway width, and that's really the technical definition of the length of the cul-de-sac street, is really to that center radius point. So we were trying to work with the applicant to get that less than 150, so then they could go with one of the city's adopted cul-de-sac standards.
And just to continue on the same vein, and they've gotten it to, somebody said 161 to somewhere a while ago.
I believe the applicant testified that the proposal as submitted is at 161. The engineer to the center radius point from the curb line on 3rd. The applicant's engineer indicated they could reduce it to 150, but I think the applicant indicated it was his desire to leave it at the 161, if I understood the testimony correctly.
So you believe they can reduce it to 150, but they don't want to?
But you can certainly ask the applicant a clarifying question directly on that point.
If we may.
Yep. Scott or the applicant, either one can come up or both.
It can be reduced to 151 is my understanding. However, to do so, we're shortening that street and making the shape of the lots less than an ideal layout. Given all the alternatives, it's our desire to leave it at 161 feet because the way that the lots lay out is superior as far as just the dynamics, lot to lot, the shape of them and whatnot. We're 11 feet past what the international standard is. So essentially what it means is when a fire truck pulls in there, when he has to back up, he's going to back up 11 feet more.
And we're talking to the center of the cul-de-sac.
To the center of the radius of the cul-de-sac, that's right. So where the standard is, we're just a little bit past it. And so our preference is that you would override that and that you would say, you know what, it's close enough, let's go with it. That's our preference. if you don't go that direction, essentially what we'll have to do is shorten that street 11 feet so that it makes the lots a little less than an ideal layout.
Okay, that's the question.
But you won't lose a lot.
It would not lose a lot, but it would make the lots not as good as they could be. Our desire when we lay this out is to lay out the design to make the best lot layout that we can. Unfortunately, we're 11 feet past an international standard. So our preference is that you override that since it's so close and that we can keep our lot layout.
Art down there had a question.
You
Art?
guys were hitting on it pretty good about exactly where we're measuring from, and to was part of the question, but I also believe that the international standards exist for a reason, and the lot layout, by being nice, is subservient to those regulations, in my opinion, but...
Wayne?
Well, along the lines of that, I'm concerned about the legalities of it. I'm concerned about that. I'm also concerned about saying, well, this time we say, well, okay, yeah, 11 feet, that's okay. The next person comes in and says, well, we're only 15 feet. Well, you see where I'm going with that. So where's the precedent become to where we start increasing the fudge factor? That being aside, I would ask the city attorney, if we are in violation of the International Fire Code, and a house catches on fire or whatever reason, are we legally responsible for something that could happen that's relevant to that problem?
I mean, it's hard to predict. I mean, I know the fire department gets audited. It may affect fire rating at some point, so everybody's, could be affected at some point. And it's not just for getting a vehicle in and happen to back up 11 feet. My understanding in fire trucks is outside of probably my expertise is that so they can get more equipment in there. It's a length of hose. That's basically how they measure it. And so if it's over 150 feet, I think they have some firefighting issues that may cause hardships.
Gary?
I mean, as Rod indicated before, you've adopted these codes. You've adopted the International Fire Code. That is the city's code. It's no longer an international code. It's adopted by the state of Idaho. City Council has also adopted it. If you desire to deviate from that code, then you must have a standard to go by. Merely because it's 11 extra feet is not, in my opinion, sufficient reason to grant leniency or ignore the code. If there is a design flaw, for instance, or a design issue. I know there was a subdivision up in, I think Walter may have been the developer of that subdivision at one time, but there was a street gradient. Width of the street, sidewalks, I believe, was the issue because of the topography. Council elected not to require a sidewalk on one side of a street in that development. That is a design issue that had to do with topography. In this case, it's not topography. It is merely that the applicant does not desire to comply with the code. So if the council decides that it desires to deviate from the code, then the council needs to make a reasoned decision as to why they are making that, granting that leniency.
Okay. Tom had a question. I want to grab him here instead. I'll come back to you, Walter.
Well, I just wanted to make a statement that I'd rather not see the 96-foot cul-de-sac, so I'd like to try to figure out making the 60-foot work. If that means staying with the 150, then I'm okay with that. If I'd rather not go against what the fire department is bringing forward with the 2009 International Fire Code. I'd like to see us figure out I think the parking thing is going to be a more ongoing day-to-day problem than a maybe someday fire on those 4 houses in the end of the cul-de-sac. If it's an issue of not allowing or allowing parking on a street that we might not normally allow parking on, I think it might be better to either allow that to happen or figure out some public parking that's put in the middle of that large block section. I don't have the answer for that, but...
Okay. John, I'll get to you in a second. Walter had something that'll come over to you, John.
If I may, while the applicant's at the podium, a different question for you.
Yes.
What is your proposed setback for houses in this plat? How
You know,
many
I'm going to
feet?
defer to Scott on that. Frankly, I don't know off the top of my head.
I believe it's 20 feet.
That is 20 feet to the property line or 20 feet
From
to
the
the curb line?
right-of-way line to the face of the house.
Right of way to the face of the house.
Okay. John?
I want to move that we table this. There seems to be a lot of information that needs to go back and forth between the city departments and the developer, and a lot of questions appear to be unanswered, and there seems to be some gray area. So I move we table this for a month.
John made a motion to table it, but I have not heard a second.
I'd like to see us have a little more discussion first about any other issues revolving around this before
Okay,
we...
the motion dies then. Without a second, Dan had something he wanted to add here. Wayne, I'll come over to you.
Well, I agree with Tom that parking is something that, I'd like to see available on there, and I don't know if there's a way we can go away from is it a requirement or a recommendation on what, because of what that street is classified?
Les?
The city of Moscow has an adopted urban street classifications map that was adopted in 2003 by the city council. It's approved by ITD. It's approved by FHWA. That document indicates that 3rd Street, as it passes through this property and beyond, would be considered an urban collector. The city also has adopted street standards, and in the case of urban collectors, the street standard is for a 35-foot wide street, 2 travel lanes, and 2 bicycle lanes. Obviously, there's always the option to add parking if you add width. I think the applicant is proposing to substitute parking for bicycle lanes, which brings up other issues.
Art, did you have something you wanted to add in here?
I was just going to get back to exactly that same issue, that on that very long stretch, a third of a mile about, where there is no on-street parking and no other provision for people to place their cars during visits, is going to be a mess, a really, really big mess. Previously, with the Windfall Hills plat, there were bump outs included on the south side of the street that would accommodate parking, not entirely along, not continuous, but places for some cars in 8-foot wide bump outs in several locations on the south side. And that was acceptable both to city council and to planning and zoning at that time. And in this plat, that dropped out. And so if some kind of provision could be obtained either by shortening the lots in some of those areas to provide some parking through there, I think we could achieve a compromise, but definitely maintaining the street up to city code for the collector street plus maintenance of the bike lanes, I think, is essential. And we have to think about what to do about the parking around that basic requirement.
Yeah, Walter?
To either Mike or Les or Bill, am I correct that the right-of-way width of this plat would allow such bump outs without having to shorten lots?
Bill?
If I may, that's correct. The prior Windfall Hills plat had a 70-foot right-of-way. There was a 70-foot right-of-way in this plat as well. And the Windfall Hills plat did accommodate the on-street parking on one side.
And, if I may?
Yeah, continue, Walter.
And so it was not a continuous parking on one side, but it had...
We have a copy of the Windfall Hills plat just so you can see how it was laid out previously. So you can see the slight widening of the roadway on the south edge there with a little division between the two. Right. So those were the expanded roadway width pockets to accommodate on-street parking on the south side of 3rd that were proposed as part of the Windfall Hills plat.
It's at least something.
Don?
Is there a rule that we have to go by that says if you've got a bike path going this way on one side of the street, you have to have one coming back this way on the other side, or can they be on the same side of the street?
Les, would you like to answer that?
I will take a try.
Stab at it?
There's not a written rule to that effect. It is, again, adopted as our street standard for an urban collector with bike lanes on either side. You would not typically build one bike lane and try to put both directions of traffic in one bike lane. Obviously, you're only talking 5 to 6 feet width. You're opposing traffic just within the bike lane. The bikes are going to be opposing. That doesn't work. Also, you don't want them going the opposite direction of the vehicular traffic and traveling that way. If you only had bike lane on one side, and it does happen, typically you would then, in some fashion, mark the other direction with maybe a sharrow or some other technique to put bikes in the travel lane with the vehicles.
Wayne?
Wes, how wide is 3rd Street between Hayes and Adams?
30 feet.
Say again?
30 feet.
30.
30.
And it has parking on one side, but no bicycle lanes.
That is correct.
Okay, I'll make a statement for how I'm feeling right now on this, guys. I don't like a 35-foot wide street with bike lanes on both sides, no parking. It becomes a major thoroughfare. It's going to be hard to keep traffic down. There's no traffic calming involved in it. I think it will be a danger. This is basically a residential neighborhood. It won't even see the traffic that 3rd Street has between Hayes and Adams. It won't even see close to the traffic that has. I would prefer to see one bicycle lane on one side and parking on the other side. That is something that the council can do, because there is that type of, and I know Les doesn't like what I'm saying, but we do have the ability to make those kind of changes. I think that would give some traffic calming. The other concern that I have, too, is once this subdivision is complete, they need to sell these lots, and these lots have to be attractive to the people that want to buy them. And if you come and you want to buy a lot, and it's like, well, I see I've got parking for 2 cars in my driveway. What about if neighbors come? Well, no, there's no parking on the street. Well, sorry, I don't want to buy the lot then. I'm going to go buy one somewhere else. It doesn't make the lot as attractive. So I will push for parking on one side and a bicycle lane on the other side.
Dan?
I think if you only have a bicycle lane on one side, you just will not have them at all. I say you have parking on both sides, and I think that this is a good place to start with the sharrows. I don't think we have them anywhere in town right now, but this might be the place to put them to give us that idea. I mean, a bicycle is a vehicle. Last I checked. Am I right, Tom? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a good place to start it. And as Wayne said, if you've got cars parked down there, that is a traffic calming device. We're coming up on the new map, and perhaps it's maybe time to make a change. This is something that we didn't have, that we thought this might be what we would want it to be. Maybe something we make something else. And then if I could, I just think back to, I'll put on another hat and fighting a fire in a 60-foot cul-de-sac with 3 trucks in there and a lot of hose laying out, and we weren't even 150 feet in, and it can be a little bit treacherous. I mean, I don't want to wish a fire upon anybody like that to worry about, but I'd just as soon see a 96-footer. And I don't know if anything up there shows what that would look like, but I also see a lot of 60-footers in the other neighborhoods, and I know of only one off the top of my head in the last few years that we've been in, and it was pretty sketchy to get in there with that, and then you got to get the trucks in and out, and that's not fun either. So, if we can do something, I say we follow the fire code one way or the other, whether it be the 96-foot cul-de-sac or whether it be at the 150-foot line.
Les, you had something you wanted to...
If I may, just as a follow-up, I guess a couple things. First off, the city of Moscow has been really putting a lot of effort over the years into becoming a bicycle-friendly community. And that's part of why the standards that we have in place include bicycle lanes. It's still the preferred way to establish a bike route on a street that would be collector status or above. Okay. In terms of whether or not there should be a collector street, I think you mentioned the intent, as was originally laid out probably back into the 90s, was that this street will eventually swing its way around to the north and actually go all the way up to Mountain View. That's a fairly lengthy section of road that will serve a lot of land and a lot of potential future subdivisions. So there will be a fair bit of traffic funneling down through this area. We need to keep that in mind. Will it match what we see on 3rd Street today, by East City Park? Maybe eventually. Okay? Probably not at first, certainly, but in time. And we need to think about that longer term. It's not just the next 5-10 years. It's going to be 30-40 years out as well. If you do choose to deviate from the adopted street standard for the urban collector, talking about putting parking on both sides or a bike lane on one side or the other, my recommendation to you would be, if you're going to do bike lane on one side and parking on the other, you do at least a 37-foot section. It's an 8-foot parking, 2 12-foot bike or vehicular lanes, and a 5-foot bike lane. You need those 12-foot lanes just for shy distance off of parked cars and to accommodate bikes and vehicles together. So that's 37. If you were to go with parking on both sides, I would recommend a 40-foot section, because now you got 2 8-foot parking strips and 2 12-foot lanes. That's 40 feet.
But just quickly then, what's the width on the other side of the creek there from Cleveland up to Grant, roughly? Or
when you start at Hayes and you work your way east past the apartments, it's 30 feet still. About half a block
Lane, it gets a little bigger.
Goes to 40, and then from there on to the creek and actually all the way to Mountain View is 44.
Oh, it's 44. Okay.
Yeah, so it's actually a larger section, and there's parking on both sides of the roadway.
Art? I'm also thinking that we need to preserve those bike paths on either side. That's a much more gradual valley up which bicyclists are going to want to pedal, as opposed to tackling rolling hills directly. And I think the only real way to get around this that preserves some parking that I think is absolutely necessary, also preserves the bike lanes, because you also don't want to have bikes in the same lane going different directions, also because that's not in accordance with Idaho law, where bikes have to ride the same direction as other vehicular traffic. But bump outs is the only thing, it seems to me, that makes much sense here, by way of preserving the lanes, preserving the traffic, and allowing for parking, all in one design.
Tom?
Well, I think if we're going to treat this as a collector, I think it does need to continue to maintain the bike lanes. I would like to see parking, and if the best design for having parking in there is to have the bump outs, that's what I'd like to see happen as well. I think that, well, as Art said, it's going to be a pretty decent slope for accessing that side of town, and I think eventually, as Les says, we're going to see that road used as a collector once it connects around the rest of the way.
Dan, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I'm leaning back towards what John started with about tabling it, because we seem to be doing a lot of design up here, and that's why I'm wondering, asking the staff, is this something that could be worked out and then come back, where tabling it would be a good option?
Bill?
If I might, if that's the council's desire, with some specific direction to staff, we have met with the applicant 3 times on these issues. They've indicated they wanted to proceed with what they had proposed, and then that puts you in the position of having to try to make a decision. If the council wants to see certain outcomes and makes that clear to the applicant, and wants the applicant to meet with staff to see how that can be accomplished, we can certainly do that. But we have met multiple times and provide several options in a couple of cases, and the applicant desired to proceed with what they had initially proposed. So,
John?
Is it proper to ask the developer whether he would be willing to sit down and try to work this out? Or,
You want to step back up here, sir?
Absolutely. There are certain things that we can certainly work with. Our goal would be to shorten Jordan Court to 150 feet. The different options that we gave to the fire department, one of them, which was accepted by the fire department, included putting a hammerhead at the end of that, which we thought would be far less safe at the end of the day. And so there are different options. I don't mind going back and forth and coming out to the best possible outcome. We have several dilemmas here, one of which is, how do we get it so that we can both have, so that we're accommodating what the fire department needs, but at the same time not taking up so much of the lots that we're rendering them unusable. I think the solution there, we can back that back to the 150. It makes the design perhaps a little less than ideal, but if the standard there is inflexible, then we can work with the 150 feet and change the lot design. As far as the consideration with the parking, there's different design alternatives that can work there. There's a point at which we get the street so wide that it's very difficult to accommodate the lots on the south side. I can't tell you exactly what that width would be, but it's a give and take between all the different design scenarios. And at some point when the street gets sufficiently wide, those lots on the south side with the slope that they have, you start backing the street into the lot, and you end up creating other issues. And so we're willing to come to the table and try and look at different alternatives. The question is, how do we balance these things? It looks like the real issue that we need to address at this point would be the parking. We are willing to consider bump outs. I'm assuming that if we could do that in such a way that we can stay within the design width of 34 feet so that the bump out goes into the planter strip so that we're not getting the street excessively wide. Perhaps that's an alternative. I'm open to your questions.
Walter?
Okay, I've got two issues that I don't know that we've got consensus on up here. I'm starting to hear a little bit.
Thank you.
I'm hearing a little bit on some of them, and I'm trying to see if we can't get somewhere with this. Les, with a non-waterline easement situation where you've got a storm and if they're correct, a storm and a sanitary 5 feet apart, a 20-foot will give you 7.5 feet on one side and 12.5 feet on the other to work. As they say, it's short. I think you can live with that. I understand the 30 if you're dealing with a 10-foot separation between a water line and a sanitary sewer line, then you're down to dealing with 5 feet on one side, and that's tough to stack dirt out of a hole. But I think that I personally believe the 20-foot easement, while not ideal, can work. A question for Mike. Mike Ray, please. In our packet, it talked about, and the applicant spoke to this, but I'm not sure if we've got a resolution, the developer's participation in the design of the park in the far east.
Amber Court.
Is that issue resolved, or do we still have a problem in staff's mind? Or maybe that's for
Certainly up for Dr. Curtis.
Dr. Curtis. Dwight, I only say that because we're all so jealous. Do we still have an issue, or do we not? The staff.
I don't think so. I mean, the fact is, it still belongs to the city. The city would make the decision. It was just some of the earlier conversations that took place led to that language. But I think we're in agreement now. So I don't see an issue.
I think we're certainly in agreement if the developer's interested in participating in cost.
Right, but that's different than being able to put restrictions on us.
I understand.
Thank you, Dwight.
Those are my only two remaining issues, and unless somebody else wishes to discuss, I'd be willing to make a crack at a motion.
Okay.
Well, just a comment that I want to make prior to you making a motion. and that would be that I really don't want to table this, because it's going to, they're going to want to break ground as soon as the weather allows them to break ground. And the more delays we give them, the more costly it can become. So, having been through this numerous times, I feel that we can come up with the guidelines that are going to be necessary to direct staff to work with the developer to come up with what we need to have done.
Tom, you had a question?
I was saying-
We're not going to take any more testimony from the audience.
I thought he was going to answer a question.
A question for you.
You need to go to the podium, Rafiq, please.
Just a comment, quick comment. Rafiq Itani again. We are continuing 3rd Street into Rolling Hills, which is at the end of that phase that they're doing. We'll continue on. I assume whatever results of parking happen on that phase will carry through to our development, because we do have a approved subdivision, and so that should be, I would like to be included in that conversation with the city, with the staff, to make sure that we are living with the same standards. That's my comment.
Okay, thank you. Tom, did you have something you wanted to say?
I'm sorry, I was just pointing to the...
Walter?
Okay, Mr. Mayor, I would make a motion that we approve the preliminary plat under the following conditions. That, and Mike, follow me here, because it's going to get a lot of bouncing balls. And if I miss something, I'd like to be advised. That the applicant shall construct the undeveloped portion of Jansen Street, including the underground utilities, before any building permits are issued for Phase 1 of the subdivision. That Jordan Court be revised in its design to a 150-foot length to the center of the cul-de-sac. That a 20-foot easement be allowed from Jordan Court, utility easement, and that bump outs in a style either equal to, at least equal to the previous developer's plat be made a part of this plat. Mike, does that leave anything hanging? Or any staff?
Well, I just had the one in there about City of Moscow development standards, that the applicant shall comply.
I would agree to include that in the motion.
How about the 150 foot?
I had that. That they would reduce to 150 and stay with the 60 foot.
And the parkland part?
Dwight said he was good to go.
Okay.
I was just looking at Bill, who has his hand up.
Just one clarification on the first item, and I know this, you read it as it reads in the staff report, but just wanted to clarify that it should actually read construction or provide security for the completion of Jansen. We do issue building permits with a development agreement and security for the public improvements. I just didn't want that to be construed to be read literally as all the improvements had to be completed before any building permits would be issued. We do accept a security furnished to complete those improvements.
That's what the memorandum says.
Yeah, I'm good.
Correct.
I was reading from the planning and zoning decision.
Correct, and I just wanted to recommend that be modified, that they shall construct or furnish security for the construction of the undeveloped portion of Jansen
Or
Street.
provide security.
Correct. I just want to clarify, that is our practice.
I would agree. Seconder?
Yep. Did you second it, Wayne?
Yep.
Okay, we got a motion with the following things that Walter just said.
Don't ask me to do
it. Did you get all those, Stephanie?
I think so.
All right. And a second from Wayne. We're going to start with John.
Aye.
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 Okay, 6-0, and it is a done deal. Now, relevant criteria, we got to talk about that.
I'd make a motion that we adopt the relevant criteria and standards that were developed by the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Second.
Bill?
Any modifications?
With the revised conditions as...
Absolutely, as Walter.
As the council.
Right.
With the modifications with the motion.
I'm okay with that. I think...
Either way,
Did you go with that?
I'll go with that.
Okay, we got Dan's motion, John's second. We will start with Art.
Aye.
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 Okay, 6-0 on the criteria, relevant criteria. Okay, that public hearing is done, and we will move on to the next thing. Thank you very much. Does anybody need to take a 5-minute break? We're going to take a 5-minute recess, Gary. What time is it now? It is
Take your 10.
8:50. We'll resume at 9 o'clock, folks.
Thank you for the play.
Hearing regarding the proposed adoption of the 2012 International Building Code and International Existing Code. Micah Chappelle, will you take over, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. Before you this evening is an item for the proposal of adoption of the 2012 International Building Code and International Existing Building Code. Some of the reasons to adopt the current code standards are that they are minimum in nature and that their primary concern are the structural integrity and fire and life safety. The interior environment and energy efficiency designs are for health and affordability. Local amendments do allow for our jurisdiction to address local issues and provide clarifications for purpose of the minimum code standards, as well as the property insurance rates are directly affected by the codes that we adopt and how we implement those. Our current list of adopted city codes are basically the 2009 International Family of Codes, as well as the 2003 Uniform Plumbing Code and the 2008 National Electrical Code. Code development is a process that's kind of circular in nature, beginning with individual citizens, concerned contractors can propose code amendments, as well as the city ourselves can propose code amendments. Those go through the International Code Council, which is made up of various members throughout the nation, and they go through hearings, through committees, and go through a voting process on what codes are amended or adopted on the international level and then proposed through the states and cities. The requirements for the state of Idaho is that any local jurisdiction with permitting programs are required to adopt the additions that are adopted by the state of Idaho. Under the Idaho Code, Title 39, Chapter 41, any amending processes require a public hearing and notice to several organizations that are interested in code application. Excuse me. The City of Moscow is amending the 2012 edition of the International Building Code with proposed amendments from the Building Code Advisory Committee. The Building Code Advisory Committee for the city is made up of several local contractors, design professionals, as well as a council representative and city staff. The significant amendments that are being proposed this evening that were considered and thoroughly discussed by the Building Code Advisory Committee are first to eliminate foster care facilities as an institutional occupancy. Next would be to allow for additional types of sprinkler systems for specific occupancies. Then we're going to provide specific address numbering standards for emergency services. We're going to specify access clearances around equipment rooms for fire pumps and risers. We're also going to provide clarification for the floor area of upholstered furniture manufacturing, storage, and display. We're going to look at providing carbon monoxide alarm installation standards. We will specify minimum load design standards for unsupported balconies. These are all outlined in the proposed ordinance. And the state of Idaho has provided for 2 amendments that are also outlined in the ordinance with modifications to 2 footnotes in a table in Chapter 29. There were no significant changes to the International Building Code proposed by the State of Idaho or the City of Moscow Building Advisory Committee. Staff recommendations are to conduct a public hearing and, upon consideration of any testimony, approve the proposed ordinance under the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary. I'm open to any questions from Councilman.
Walter? Michael, if you would back up, I think, 2 or 3 slides to the...
Sir.
Yeah, nope, there.
Okay.
Down, 3rd bullet from the bottom, is this proposing that carbon monoxide alarms be installed in new construction or not, or what?
Under the proposal, it actually will read that carbon monoxide alarms in new and existing Group I and R occupancies located with a building that's containing a fuel-burning appliance or a building that has an attached garage where a permit is required for additions, remodels, or gas mechanical work shall be equipped with single-station carbon monoxide detectors. So, to answer your question more clearly, is if someone comes in to pull a permit for addition, remodel, or fuel gas mechanical appliance work, they will be required to install a carbon monoxide alarm.
And if I may? Go ahead. And that alarm would be required to be to a central station or anything. It would be like a smoke alarm in your house. An audible alarm for the occupants.
An audible alarm for the occupants. Single station alarm, as defined, is going to be, it's not interconnected, and it's just the one individual device that's operational within the structure.
Okay, and I
have
one more on the list.
Follow-up to what you just asked.
Go ahead.
So that would include, for instance, these type of carbon monoxide alarms that we can buy that we just plug into an outlet?
Yes, sir.
Those would be acceptable?
Yes, sir.
Other questions for Micah? Walter?
Under the foster care item, eliminating foster care facilities as an institutional occupancy, can you tell me what the thinking is there?
Under the definition in institutional occupancies, there's a discussion about the number of fostered individuals. As for an institutional occupancy, that would be 5 or more persons. So under that, if an individual residential occupancy had 6 foster care individuals that they're housing, as the code would read, they would be considered an I occupancy and be required to install standards to an I occupancy instead of an R occupancy, which is the residential standard.
And this change that you're proposing that we approve tonight would do what?
Would eliminate the foster care facility from that requirement being to eliminate foster care facilities that exceed that number of occupants.
So 6 or more, they would not apply?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Micah? Thank you, Micah. We'll officially open the public hearing, and if anybody would like to come up and make comments, general comments or whatever, come on up, sir. State your name, address, if you would, even though we all know who you are, David.
Starting to worry David was not going to say anything tonight.
Well, I wasn't planning on saying anything, but since this foster care facilities thing came up...
David, you need to identify yourself and your address for the record.
David Pierce, 716 East F Street.
Thank you, David.
Since this foster care facilities thing came up, and it's only, as I understood what he said, cover when you have 6 or more people under foster care in a facility. It seems to me that at that point, you're taking care of a very large number of people, and although it wasn't said, I think this would put them back to having to have no more than any requirements that went with residents. And that doesn't seem to me like it's taking care of these people who are in foster care very well. I don't think that's a very good idea to change that, because you're talking about having so many people who are being taken care of. Thank you.
Yep. Could we have additional testimony out there? And then we'll try to answer a question here. No additional testimony. I will close it. Gary, you had a question you wanted to say, or a point you wanted to make?
No, sir. I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Walter?
Michael? I'm pretty sure you were not here when the committee did their work in 2012.
Unfortunately, no, sir.
And Sue Scott, the council liaison to that committee, is not here. Can you speak to the why, maybe, I don't know if Bill sat in on it, the why of eliminating the foster care requirement?
Bill? If I may, I think my understanding of that amendment was to modify a section of the code that refers to those type of institutional uses that are caring for 5 or fewer persons, and to eliminate foster care facilities from that list. And Micah can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a section of the code, and it's actually in the draft ordinance on page, I get to the bottom of the page 3 of 11, that reads section 308.4.1, 5 or few persons receiving care.
It's the other way around.
Correct.
Okay.
So what I think the concern from the Building Code Advisory Committee was, if somebody was fostering 3 children, they didn't want them to be considered to be a foster care facility and have to put a sprinkler system in, because it was not of something of a magnitude of an institutional use if you're providing care for that larger number of foster children.
Right.
So I think that was really the intent of the amendment. Now, it may not actually be necessary, because a foster care facility is actually defined as providing care for more than 5, I believe.
Correct.
So it's kind of an oddity in the code that they actually even put it in the list, because if you were caring for fewer than 5, then I think technically you're not a foster care facility underneath the way the building code definitions work. But I think the Building Code Advisory Committee wanted to make it sure that somebody who was fostering fewer than 5 children wouldn't get caught into this interpretation and be required to put in a fire suppression system. That was, I believe, the intent. Mike, please correct me if that's
That's correct.
wrong.
It was more of a clarification on almost conflicting areas of the code.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Micah. Dan?
I would like to make a motion that we approve this ordinance under suspension of the rules, require 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Tom, second. Okay, we have a motion by Dan to approve this with the suspension of the rules, requiring 3 complete and separate readings, that it can be read and titled by published and by summary. Seconded by Tom. I will start with John.
Aye.
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 Aye. Okay, and it passed 6-0. Very good. We'll move on to the next thing. Thank you, Micah.
Your Honor, you
I'm
need
sorry.
to take the number and read it by title, sir.
Okay. Ordinance 2014-01, an ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 7, Chapters 1 and 12, adopting the 2012 edition of the International Building Code and the International Existing Building Code, with minor amendments to each, providing that provision of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law.
There we go.
Okay, we will move on to item number 7, which is Idaho Departments of Parks and Recreation grant application, Lola Clyde Park. Alyssa Anderson and Dwight will present. Hi, Alyssa. How are you?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Oops. So before you tonight, we have a grant request to apply for funds to do some development at Lola Clyde Park. And for those of you that don't know, Lola Clyde is located on the corner of Polk and Rodeo. This property was purchased in 1996 for $58,850, I believe. And since that time, the only development that has taken place is the bridge that you can see in this picture. And I believe that it was built in approximately 2008. There has been some discussion about development of this park over time, and this is actually a student diagram that was brought forth to the city, I think it was in 2008, but there has been several different exercises done by U of I students looking at proposed development of this park. Tonight what we're looking at is a Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation grant application, and as I move on further, you'll see that we're proposing to submit 2 separate applications. What we're looking at under the Idaho Department of Parks and Rec is the Recreational Trails Program, which this year has $2 million in it. And normally it's $1.5 million, but they had additional reserve that was going to expire, so there will be $2 million in that fund. And then also we're looking at the Road and Bridge program, which has about $250,000, but usually doesn't get very many applications. So what we're looking at tonight are two separate projects or an entire project altogether. For the road and bridge application, we're looking at wanting to apply for the funding for that, and I'll go over the amounts here in a moment, for this section right here, which would be frontage on Polk Avenue, or excuse me, Polk Extension. And it would consist of a pathway and also a parking lot, and I think we have 1 or 2 ADA parking spots, and it would make the pass system basically would be a replacement for a sidewalk, but we would have the curb and gutter improvements along Polk Avenue and a connection with the bridge into the park that would be ADA accessible. And then the other part of the project would be to put in a pass system. As you can see, it kind of moves around the outer edge of the park. And under the Recreational Trails Program, you can fund you can fund both of these types of applications, the parking lot and the trail program, and also a trail. And I spoke with the representative for our area for District 1, and they encourage you to submit 2 separate applications. You have a better chance of being funded. So what we're looking at is an application under Road and Bridge for the smaller portion of the project for the parking lot and the frontage improvements, which includes the pass system on the west side of Hog Creek. The second part of the project is just the pass system within there. So as I move forward, what you're looking at here is the budget for just the road and bridge project. And these numbers have been updated from what you saw in your staff council report that you had in your packet this week. One of the changes is that we included traffic control under contractors, under the contractor fees, rather than having staff be responsible for managing that. We'd prefer that the contractor be responsible for that. And on this budget, you can see that there is a category that says either matching or grant funds. And what we're looking at this point in time is, depending upon whether staff is available and how many projects we have planned for the construction season of 2015, we would either propose that a cash match be provided or an in-kind match. And the items in red are under the Public Works and include the Engineering Department and also the Street Department, looking at a match of approximately $79,898. Then also there's a match for Parks and Rec to do their portion of items that they've previously performed on other park projects, and the match there is $13,888. Then we'd be looking at bidding out the items in yellow, which would include the construction, which would be the paving and all the things that are listed there: base paving, hydroseeding, lighting, concrete drainage, and traffic control, which would be the $147,208. And then we also have to have a separate consultant that does the testing of the asphalt and those other things. So for the road and bridge project, we're looking at $244,494. And we're proposing that we apply for a grant of $150,708, which is 62% of this portion of the project, and matching funds of $93,786, which is 38%. Then the second application, which would include the entire project, has updated numbers, and in red you can see that we're looking at Public Works part of the project to be at $139,923, Parks and Rec at $18,035, and then construction would be at $282,893 with testing at $6,000. So the combined projects together would be $446,851. And I do want to share that under this grant program, we're not allowed to have a separate line item for contingency, so there is a 10% built into each of these line item numbers for contingency. And as we've moved forward with this project, we've submitted these grants before. Last time we had Heron's Hideout Project, and we did a 50-50 because we purchased property and then just the construction was paid for. But from looking at a lot of the grants that have been submitted for this, even though there's only a 20% match requirement under a recreational trails program, very few are funded in this dollar amount unless they have at least 30 or over in match. And as I stated earlier, we have a combined match for the total project. It's looking at about 35%, $157,958. And then the grant amount would be approximately $288,893. And that would do the entire project. Now, at this point in time, Public Works isn't sure what their 2015 schedule is going to look like. The Parks Department is relatively sure that they would be able to work this into their 2015 schedule. So at this point in time, we're proposing that we look at 2 separate grant applications, submitting them based upon the numbers that you have in this agenda here today. And then Gary's going to talk to you about how we're looking at funding the matching part of the project.
Dan had a question here, Gary, before we... Dan.
So, Lisa, just so we're clear, and if you go back to your map, the first grant is just this part.
Yes.
The second application is everything.
Yes.
So what happens if we get both?
Give one of them back.
I mean, is that the case? We would give the smaller one back?
The Parks and Rec staff will be there to let them know. The road and bridge projects are funded prior to the recreational trails program. So if we were funded under road and bridge, they would let the recreational trails program
shorten that grant by that much. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so that was, and I think you answered my other question, that are both of them a 20% required match?
Road and bridge does not require a match, but they're normally not funded unless you provide one.
Yeah, it looks like that makes it more desirable to have, that's a pretty large match.
It makes us much more competitive, especially with the size of a project.
Okay, thank you.
Gary? Thank you, Your Honor. One of the things that we run into with this, we try to stretch our dollars as far as we can, and in this case, we have in-kind match, as you can see, of 35%, which is a pretty large match. However, we have priorities in the engineering department, in the Parks and Rec department. We anticipate we will be able to meet these grant obligations. If the priorities change and we're unable to meet those grant obligations, and we will look to fund these with cash in the FY 2015 budget cycle. So either way, if we're able to do it with in-kind, which is what we fully expect, but if it turns out that we're unable to do that, that will come before you in the FY 2015 budget.
Walter?
Well, Lisa, you may have said it, I may have missed it. The timing on this, the applications are due when, and you anticipate answers when?
The application is due next Friday, which is always the last Friday of the month, so my goal is to submit it on Wednesday. It's 15 copies of each. The Recreational Trails Program does not make decisions until probably September. Wow. August or September. And the Road and Bridge Program would probably be in June or July.
So, following up with Gary, you're going to need to budget cash against these when you do the 15 budget this spring and summer without knowing the answer.
We won't have the answer as to whether we have that portion of the grant or not, but we will know what the priorities are in these departments by that time.
Exactly, but you're going to have to be prepared to do it either by in-kind work or by cash before you know whether or not we've got a project.
Yeah, by that time the departments will be able to give their feedback and determine whether they'll be able to meet the in-kind match requirement.
Okay.
Just a couple of other items to share. We have another upcoming project that will be built summer of 2014, maybe summer of 2015, we're not sure. The section of Polk right here We'll be completing the sidewalk that connects to the sidewalk that was put in when the Hillsides, or Greensides project was put in. And there's also a connecting path system. If you look right where the driveway is, right in here, that is a part of the Greensides development. It's a public system, a trail system that meanders throughout that project. And then also PCEI has a trail system that's right in here. So, this makes it a much more fundable project. Not all of it will be ADA accessible, but the part within our project will be. And one of the questions that we had in committee, in Public Works Committee, is we also will have lighting on the interior part of the path and in the parking lot areas. So it will be, lit in the evenings and nighttime for security purposes.
Tom?
I have a few questions. I'm wondering, you just mentioned the sidewalk piece here. Within that, I've noticed coming southbound on Polk Street, the road narrows suddenly at one point, and there's a really big pothole in the. I'm wondering if that composition of that roadway is going to be modified when we do the sidewalk piece.
Yes.
It just seems real dangerous for right-leaning traffic, like bicycles or people that are hugging the right side of the road in their cars, and it sounds like.
Yes, and I know the street department did some work there last year, and I think it has settled. So I'm thinking maybe this summer they'll look at grading that again, and then the other side of the street will be taken care of with the sidewalk system.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm wondering if there is overlap funding here. I'm wondering if there's this undeveloped piece of rodeo here. If there's any sidewalk work or curb work or anything that could be moved over, or is that just not allowed within the scope if it's not described right now in the application?
Without having the money to go ahead and do all the improvements on rodeo,
Not the whole thing. I'm just talking about that little section on that side of it.
At this point, we haven't planned for that. That could be a potential future application. I did want to add that we will be putting in ADA accessible curb ramps and also a crosswalk on the corner of Rodeo and Polk that will connect to the sidewalk project. It'll be placed there for crossing. So some of the street improvements will include that, but as far as anything down Rodeo, we haven't planned for that right now.
Sure.
Go ahead, Tom.
And then I've mentioned this before, but there is a very wet area right here. I would recommend that the final path design swing out a little bit away from this wet area and just avoid that, just because it'll be a problem.
And I did share your recommendation with the engineering department,
So
and we just haven't updated this design, but when they do the survey and the staking and all that, we'll certainly take that into consideration. And we actually have, with the Polk project, we're looking at doing some in-kind mitigation where we would do some plantings in that exact area for the Polk project.
Okay, and the last thing was, you mentioned that the only development before has been the bridge, but about the same time of the bridge, or perhaps a little bit before, there was some re-meandering of the stream and a lot of planting, and maybe it's already in the thing. So, all right, thanks.
I will refer to that in the application because, yes.
It's probably not, okay, thanks.
John?
Coming to this late, how did this Lola Clyde Park development come to the forefront? We've got a lot of parkland that needs to be developed. Why this? Dwight, I guess, probably could answer that.
Come on up.
I will tell you one of the reasons why is because this funding's available for recreational trails, and it's normally not this amount of money, so it was taking advantage of this part of the project, but I'll let Dwight address those other items.
That's a pretty big reason. And also, we've done it's still preliminary, but a forecast of priorities of our various parks, undeveloped parks, and this is right up at the top. And they based it on accessibility is the primary thing. A lot of the other properties you can't get to yet, so we can't develop them. This one is very developable. It's sort of in the same category as Joseph Street Fields. It's just ready. We just had to get some funding and to get it going. The big hang-up of this particular park has always been the road improvements, and this one particular grant takes care of a huge chunk of that if we get it, and which will open up the rest of the park for fairly easy development.
Thank you.
Walter?
Mr. Mayor, I'd make a motion we approve submittal of the grant applications to the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation for development of Lola Clyde Park as submitted.
Second.
Okay, Walter made the motion to approve this. Tom seconded it. I will start the roll call with Art. Aye.
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 Okay, and that is a done deal, 6-0. Okay, we will move on to item number 8, which is judicial confirmation for the water capital projects. Gary Reedner and Les will be presenting this, so. Well, number 10.
Etc.
Thank you, Your Honor. And no, I'm not Danielle Quaid, our consulting attorney from Holly Troxel. Danielle talked to you at our last council meeting when the public hearing was conducted regarding judicial confirmation. This item has been discussed for the last couple of years. It has to do with the construction and development of well number 10, which is our newest well to be located near the state line at the end of A Street West. We've obtained a Department of Environmental Quality revolving loan fund to finance that project, and we are moving ahead with the development. It's been identified in our water comprehensive plan as the next development that needs to be done as far as our water supply. We have a water right to utilize that well, not as a new source, but as a redundant source. That's one of the reasons that we're moving ahead with judicial confirmation in this case as an ordinary necessary expense, because the current codes require that we have a redundancy in our system, and our system is currently deficient as far as fire flow and provision of water when our largest producing well, well number 9, goes down. You'll recall at one time that we had anticipated also moving ahead with the Northwest Reservoir rehabilitation or replacement at that time as well. It was determined that with the redundancy to be created by well number 10, that we could not classify replacing that reservoir at this time as an ordinary necessary expense. I'll go into that in just a moment. As we looked at other elements of our water comprehensive plan that were deficient in that they did not meet our current fire code requirements, fire flow requirements, and provision of water, we looked at any other pieces of that comprehensive plan that could be classified as being an ordinary necessary expense because the fact that we do not meet the minimum requirements of those codes. Those that were identified were some booster station projects, 6 booster stations within the city of Moscow that provide water pressure for fire flow, as well as some additional piping in Indian Hills development, and piping to well number 10, and for the booster station project totaling approximately $4.2 million. Idaho Constitution, Article 8, Section 3, prohibits a city from incurring debt beyond its current budget year unless it is subject to a vote of the public. In this case, it's a revenue bond, would require 1/2 plus 1 of the electorate to pass that bond, or it can be classified as an ordinary necessary expense. If it is determined to be an ordinary necessary expense, then the district court will so find, and that will authorize the city to issue its debt instruments in order to finance these improvements. Now, those debt instruments can either be a bond, could be a loan of some sort, such as the DEQ revolving loan. What it does, and the DEQ revolving loan requires, that we also also show that we have the current ability to legally incur that debt. So that's why we're moving ahead at this time. As you recall, in December, we came forward to the council. Council passed a resolution at that time setting a public hearing to take place on January 6th. That public hearing, the subject of that public hearing was to take public input to determine whether or not the public had any input regarding the filing of a petition for judicial confirmation. That hearing was held at that time under the code. Council was allowed to consider that public testimony and then to move ahead within the next 2 weeks, certainly the next meeting, to consider that testimony and determine whether it wanted to move ahead with the filing of that petition. I won't belabor the point. You've heard this time and again. The committees have heard it time and again. These are necessary improvements. We have been approved for the revolving loan fund for $2.7 million for the development of well number 10. Les has indicated that he has submitted an application for the revolving loan fund monies for the booster stations and other improvements as well. Again, that is just a way of incurring that debt. It still requires judicial confirmation or a vote in order to provide the city with authority to incur that debt. What we're here today to do is to have the council determine whether to consider the testimony that was given at the public hearing on January 6th and to determine whether or not it wishes to move ahead with judicial confirmation. If the council decides that it wishes to move ahead and requests the district court to make that determination, our attorney, Danielle Quaid, and Nicole Pantera from Hawley Troxel will, with the assistance of city staff and the city attorney, will file a petition with the district court for that determination. The process is the council, if it determines that it wishes to move ahead with the petition, and a draft petition is in your packet. This is, I believe, the third time that you've seen it. It's been honed a little every time, become more accurate as those facts are developed. If the council decides it wishes to proceed with that, there is a resolution in your packet that makes the necessary findings that the council has considered in order to move ahead with filing that petition. Also, if the council decides to decides to adopt the resolution, and the petition will be attached as a exhibit to that resolution, then there is a draft ordinance in your packet as well. That ordinance is the next step after the filing of the petition to move ahead with the ordinary necessary determination. The findings, and I'll just point the council to those particular findings. They're found on page 2 of 3 of that resolution. That the mayor and council deem the ordinary necessary improvements are for the public good and welfare and will improve the health, safety, comfort, and convenience of the city, residents of the city, users of the system. That the council declares there is an immediate need to design and construct the ordinary necessary improvements. That is pursuant to the deficiencies in the system that don't meet those minimum safety codes. That the petition, which is also within the packet, is approved. The mayor is authorized to execute and validate the same, and that bond counsel is authorized to file it with the district court and obtain a judgment with the district court that is in conformance with what we're asking for, and that is the authority to move ahead with issuing that debt. And that amount of that debt will not exceed $4,295,000 plus required reserves, cost of issuance to finance the city's project cost. As Don, I'm sure, will be happy to stand up here and tell you, there are attendant costs that go along with issuing municipal debt, and those amounts would also be included. Last, number 5, is merely a clause that says if any portion of the petition is determined to be invalid, that it doesn't affect the enforceability of the entire petition and the resolution. So, if the council would like to discuss the resolution and the petition, I can then talk about the ordinance if you wish.
Questions from the council for Gary? Dan?
I would make a motion that we adopt this resolution to approve filing the petition for judicial confirmation, which makes the findings and declarations regarding financing cost of ordinary and necessary improvements, and that authorizes the filing of the petition for judicial confirmation.
Second.
Okay, we got Dan's motion to adopt a resolution, approval filing a petition of judicial confirmation, and Tom's second. I will start with John.
Aye.
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 Aye. Okay, that passes. And now I will read this resolution, which is 201404, a resolution of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, making findings and declarations with respect to financing the cost of certain ordinary and necessary improvements to the domestic water systems serving the residents of the city, approving and authorizing, subject to judicial confirmation, the financing of the ordinary and necessary improvements, authorizing the filing of a petition for judicial confirmation in the District Court of the 2nd Judicial District of the State of Idaho, and providing for related matters, providing this resolution to be effective upon its passage, approval, and publication according to law. And that again is Resolution 2014-04.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Gary.
Next step is to consider, and staff's recommendation is to approve the petition for judicial confirmation. That is also contained in your packet. Again, I believe this is the third time that council has seen this draft petition. It will be attached to both the resolution and the ordinance, sir, when it is filed. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I'll make a motion to approve the petition for judicial confirmation.
I'll second.
Okay, Wayne made the motion to approve it with Art's second, and I will start with Art.
Aye.
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 That passes. Now, do I need to read anything else, Gary? Or
Not until until the council considers the ordinance, sir. Okay, what you have before you is the ordinance that is required under Idaho Code, Title 50, Section 1035, which is known as the Idaho Revenue Bond Act. This ordinance is required when the council approves the judicial confirmation, or approves the filing of the petition. There has to be an ordinance in place evidencing the issuance of that debt. So if you go through Section 1 of that, it sets the amount of the debt, $4,295,000 plus required reserves and issuance costs, that we will attach the design, construction, and installation to this as they are developed, that it is desired that debt is incurred by the city in order to finance these improvements, that the bonds will be authorized pursuant to ordinance, and this is very important, that the bonds shall not be a debt of the city, and the city shall not be liable thereon, nor shall the bonds be payable out of any funds other than the revenues of the system. Such bonds shall not be payable from ad valorem property taxes. That's why this is a revenue bond. The folks who purchase these bonds may look to the revenues of the utility and not to the general taxes of the city. And the last two sections provide provisions for publication, as well as the officers of the city are directed to act in conformance with this ordinance.
Mr. Wayne.
Well, I'm glad you read that, Gary. Particularly Section 5, I think, is very important, because one of the questions I know that we've all probably fielded was, if this bond is passed, are you going to raise our water rates to do it? And this specifically speaks to the fact that we would not, that it does come out of revenue of the system.
We already have.
Well, other than what we already have done. There won't be an additional increase to cover this bond. Am I saying this right?
Well, I think
it's coming out of the current funds that we're bringing in.
It will. This section, Section 5, states that no taxes will be used to pay for these bonds. There may be additional increases in conformance with the rate study, which was just completed. The debt that is represented by this, and further debt down the road to finance those improvements, would be the result of any increases or current water rates. It is done in conformance with both the plan and that rate study. But suffice it to say that this has been anticipated. It was anticipated in the first rate study, and it was anticipated in the rate study that was just completed this last year. So those rates are implemented, and I believe it's a 5-year rate horizon, 7-year rate horizon, that amortization of this debt has been considered in the formulating of those rates for the next 7 years.
Walter. Mr. Mayor, I'd make a motion to approve the ordinance evidencing the city's intent to issue the revenue bonds and provide the basis for the judicial confirmation under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that the ordinance be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Okay, we have Walter's motion and Tom's second to pass this ordinance, and I will start with John.
Aye.
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 Okay, and that completes it. Stephanie, is this 02, 20-01402? Okay, this is ordinance 2014-02, an ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, approving and authorizing certain ordinary and necessary improvements to the domestic water system serving the residents of the city, setting forth the estimated cost of the ordinary and necessary improvements, ordering the design and construction of ordinary and necessary improvements, authorizing the issuance of revenue bonds in the amount up to $4,295,000, plus required reserves and issuance costs to finance the ordinary and necessary improvements, providing for the payment of such bonds, providing for other related matters, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on, that is towards the end of our agenda, folks. We're going to skip reports tonight. I would entertain a motion to adjourn to move to executive session.
I would move that we adjourn to executive session and not reconvene.
Second.
Okay.
Your Honor, if I may?
Yes.
If you could describe again in the initial part of the agenda as to the code section you're utilizing and moving into executive session.
This is Idaho Code Section 67-23451, in parentheses F, the good faith reason for being the need to discuss legal ramifications of legal options for potential litigation in a time-sensitive manner.
Thank you, and you will not be moving into, won't be reconvening into regular session.
That's correct.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Well, we better take a vote.
Oh,
You need to vote on it, sir.
John, we'll start with you.
Aye.
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 Done deal.
Wake up, Art.
Thank you very much.
Wake up, Art.